Brain fitness is popular. You can't help but look in the news today, open up a newspaper, peruse the internet, and you see a variety of products that are out there all saying that if you do this, it will help your brain health. You'll be younger. Your brain will be acting as if you were in your 20s or 30s. These products are just blossoming out there. And so this is just a snapshot of when I did a quick Google search of all the things that I saw, and there were too many to put on here. But clearly there's an interest in the public to find something that will prevent cognitive decline. That is one of our concerns as we age, that we want to be acting younger. We want our brains to be as nimble as they were a long time ago. And in fact, really, from a public health perspective, this has gotten a lot of attention. The National Institute on Aging has a focus on cognitive health on their website. The Alzheimer's Association, as Maria alluded to, has paid a great deal of attention to it. And then, in fact, the Institute of Medicine published a report earlier this year all about cognitive aging. And in this report, they dedicated a good chunk of one chapter to cognitive training and cognitive stimulation activities, and is there enough evidence to make a formal recommendation? So today I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do know and what we don't know about cognitive stimulation and cognitive training, and then provide a summary. I think it's important to step back and first provide a little bit of a background about some definitions. So when we say cognitive stimulation, or at least when I say cognitive stimulation, I'm talking about sort of that lifelong learning or brain challenging activities. For you, this might be doing the crossword puzzle in the newspaper, card games, etc. These are stimulating activities from your brain, but they are not cognitive training interventions. And when we do talk about cognitive stimulation, I think one of the important things is that it really is stimulating. It's not that you're always doing the same easy crossword puzzle on Mondays, but you're avoiding the Fridays and Saturdays. It's really trying to challenge your brain, lifelong learning, doing something new. And then when I talk about cognitive training today, I really mean cognitive training. It's formal instruction and providing you strategies and ways to adapt to your situation and take on new information. So there is a difference here, and I'm going to be talking a lot about cognitive training studies and what the research has shown to us. So some of the key questions that I'm going to address in this talk is, does cognitive stimulation and or training, does it help us maintain our memory and thinking ability, or does it enhance it? Does training eventually transfer over to real-world tasks? It's great if you can learn a test that you're going to do in a memory clinic, but does it help you with your shopping lists? Does it help you with all your to-dos? Does it transfer over to managing your medications, paying bills, things like that? So what's really helpful is if it does transfer, as opposed to learning to the test, if you will. And then lastly, does training in one area, such as memory, learning memory skills, does it transfer over to another cognitive domain, such as speed of processing? So training in one area doesn't impact others, and I'm going to touch upon that as well. I'm going to focus on a few training examples of research studies that really looked at cognitive training. The first is I'm going to talk about a randomized clinical trial, probably the largest to date, called the ACTIVE trial, the Advanced Cognitive Training for Independent and Vital Elderly. And I'm going to dig in deep to some of the data and share that with you today. Oops, it looks like my fonts are a little off. Does training can you do training in a real world setting? And I'm going to share some findings from the Experience Corps, which I find just a remarkable program. And lastly, but in the middle there, we have a study that Maria touched upon earlier, the FINGER study, which looked at a multi-interventional approach that embedded some cognitive training with diet and exercise, sort of a multifaceted program. So first I'm going to talk about the ACTIVE trial, and this was a program that I did have, I worked on when I was at Johns Hopkins, and it does stand for the Advanced Cognitive Training for Independent and Vital Elderly. This was a very large study, about 2,800 older adults across 6 or 7 sites. And participants were randomized to one of 3 cognitive training intervention arms that I'm going to get into a little bit later about training for memory, for reasoning skills, speed of processing, or a control group where there was just some education but not formal cognitive training. A little bit about the study's design. So ACTIVE was very unusual, and I'm going to get to the participant demographics in a little bit, but they really did target older adults who they thought were at risk for cognitive and functional decline from 6 cities across the United States. Participants were over the age of 65. They did exclude people with a mini mental score less than 23 or people who did have self-reported Alzheimer's disease. And they also excluded those who had substantial difficulty with daily activities, such as needing assistance with dressing or personal hygiene. One of the things that is important to know about the ACTIVE study is that it was a long-term study, but it was never designed to look at whether the training interventions delayed diagnosis to dementia of any sort. So it was looking at improvements in cognition across various domains, functional ability, independent activities of daily life, activities of daily living, but it did not look at whether training itself delayed the diagnosis to dementia. So we have to keep that in mind when we're looking at the findings. So here's a snapshot of the baseline characteristics of those who enrolled in the ACTIVE study. Again, 2,800 older adults from 6 sites across very urban centers. Average age was nearly 74 years old, predominantly female. And what I'd like to point out here is that 26% were African American. And that for those of you that do clinical trial research, this is really noteworthy because most of participants who do step forward and raise their hands and often participate in clinical trial research are Caucasian. And here they were able, because they went into the urban centers, they went into churches to recruit, they got a very large percentage of African American adults. Most did have a high school diploma, but they also were not the highly educated group that we often see in clinical trial research. Oftentimes we see when we're doing clinical trials that most have at least a bachelor's degree, if not higher. These majority had a high school degree. So we were targeting people who were at risk for decline. Only about 35% were married, and many were widowed. And again, MMSE score average was about 27, but it did range from 23 to 30. So ACTIVE was very interesting in that it was first designed to provide 10 sessions, cognitive training interventions, that lasted about 60 to 75 minutes each. So a bolus of cognitive training, and then they were going to follow people for about 2 years. Midway through the program, they decided to randomize people to receive an additional booster training, but that booster didn't really make a difference. These were small group training interventions that were led by a trained instructor. And then during the class, you both did group exercises with your instructor and then worked on individual. So there was also a social dynamic here. You imagine that cognitive training, here you're in a group with your peers. You can talk about your concerns that you're sharing. You can learn from each other, as opposed to doing this at home in front of a computer by yourself. And ACTIVE really focused on strategies for remembering, for problem solving, for responding quickly to information, again with the goal of helping with real world activities. They didn't want to basically train to the test, so that we're going to give you strategies, and so we give you a memory test at the beginning before you come in, and then we're going to give you that same memory test at the end, and that's how we're gauging our improvement. So again, real world strategies, not teaching to the test. And I'm not sure how well you can see this from the slide, but really these 3 arms are really focused on improving to that particular cognitive domain. ACTIVE did not think that training in memory, that is providing memory strategies, would necessarily help with your ability to respond to new information quickly. But the hope was, so they did not suspect that training would transfer to different cognitive domains, but they did hypothesize that every type of cognitive training would eventually help with real-world activities, such as everyday problem solving, your ability to do independent activities of daily life and ADL, your speed of processing, and really then hopefully think about, keeping people independent longer at home. So I'm going to give a little bit of a snapshot about how about each of the interventions that they did. Memory training was focused on a few different strategies. Visualizing words along a path, and I'll provide some examples. Grouping things into meaningful categories. So if you had a shopping list, grouping them into the produce department or the canned goods or the bakery. Perhaps some ordering about order of importance, and then relying on external visual aids and cues. The inductive reasoning really focused on solving problems and looking for rules and patterns in your daily life, with the goal of hopefully transferring over to these real-world tasks of managing complicated medication logs when you take certain pills, or balancing the checkbook, paying bills. And then speed of processing really looked about how much you can take in from your visual field, how much information you can process all at once. And that's been shown to help transfer over to driving ability. So here's one of the memory cues or the memory training examples that was used in active, and this is Memory Man. And participants were given a long list of items, almost like what you would see in your shopping list, and they were instructed to try to visualize where they would place those items on a person's body. It's sort of a mnemonic device, right? And so up at the head, you would try to put the fish, and down at the toes, you would have cheese, or things like that. So this is what it would almost look like if you were picturing as you placed your items on Memory Man. And you could do it on a person, or you could visualize a walking path, so that as you're walking along in the park or along your neighborhood, try to place items as a memory training device. This probably works really well for people who are visual, not me. Here's an example of some of the reasoning training. So they wanted people to find patterns in schedules, and they gave strategies with the goal of then trying to transfer this type of training to something as complicated as a medication log for managing several different medications, number of pills several times a day, et cetera. And here's an example of the useful field of view, and really what you're seeing here is how much information certain people can take in a quick glance, in just a second. And you can see that it does narrow over time, and so the goal is to try to move it from the smaller light circle out into the lighter blue circle over time. So active was originally designed to only follow up people for 2 years. And after 2 years, so participants came in for a 10-session intervention. Remember, 10 sessions that were 60 to 75 minutes long to learn some memory strategies, or inductive reasoning, or speed of processing strategies. Then they came back 2 years later, and the findings were quite robust. I'm not going to show those here. I'm going to focus on the 5-year and then the 10-year findings. Because the 2-year findings were so robust, the researchers got some more funding, and they brought people back 5 years afterwards. And what you see here, starting with the memory training, is that those who received memory training in the blue had much better performance on memory measures 5 years after those 10 trainings, after those 10 sessions. Reasoning training, again, those who received reasoning training in red, and you can see the reasoning here in the middle, right here, performed so much better on the reasoning training. You don't see improvements in reasoning for those who received speed of processing or memory training. They were very specific to the area of training that the participant received. And the speed of training effects were quite robust 5 years after the results. So now I'm going to show you the 10-year results that were published last year. And so this is just for the memory, and you can see, and this is over time. So this is where everybody was at baseline. This is immediately after training. This is at year 1, year 2, year 3, year 5, and year 10. So after about 10 years, the memory training, the people who received memory training were about back to where they were on baseline, and here are the control participants. So the memory training effects had dissipated by year 5, but again, they had only received 10 training sessions 10 years ago, but they were still doing better than those than the controls. Here's the inductive reasoning, and these were statistically significant. So again, here they are at baseline, immediately after training, 1 year, 2 years, a 3-year slightly improvement, and here they are doing significantly better than their peers who received interventions in the other training arms. And lastly, the speed of processing, which are very, very robust. As you can see that they are doing significantly better than their peers who did not receive speed of processing on speed of processing tasks. So this is telling us that a small intervention, 10 sessions, can have long-lasting effects. And it's not that they were just teaching to the test, but it does not transfer over to other abilities. So those who received speed of processing only showed improvement in that domain, not in memory or not in reasoning. But really what was so important to active was how does it impact somebody's daily life? Does it transfer? And what we saw here is that there is somewhat of an improvement in the ability to carry out those activities of daily life, and most notably, only the reasoning and the speed of processing people at 10 years were still showing improvement on those activities of daily life. The memory trained individuals, it didn't quite reach statistical significance. But this does show some promise that perhaps a cognitive training intervention with some tasks may help people carry out their activities of daily life. And as I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, what we don't know from active, and what I think we all want to know, is whether cognitive training interventions delays diagnosis to MCI or dementia. That's really what we want to know, and it's unfortunate that it wasn't designed to look at that from the start. But I think if we now know that there is some long-term benefit of cognitive training, that is the next study that needs to happen, because this is something that is relatively easy, right? And we can try to implement. So just a summary of the active finding state. There's we can still see benefits 5 to 10 years after training, after that brief 10 session, 60 to 75 minute sessions. There were really early effects for those who received speed of processing that were quite robust. Those who did have slightly lower MMSE scores, those who were scores 20, 24, 25, 26, they did not benefit from memory training. So that is something that we need to take in mind, that as we're thinking about doing interventions in populations that do have slight impairment, the memory training in those impaired populations, it didn't really show an improvement. But those with lower MMSE scores did show improvement on the speed of processing or the inductive reasoning training. Interestingly, people didn't think that their memory was doing better either. So there was no subjective memory improvement after training. You would think that after you did a cognitive training intervention, you would say, my memory's doing better. There was just no difference between those who were assigned to an intervention and the control group. And that could be because that social interaction that I talked about. So the control group still got together. They learned about Alzheimer's disease, dementia, brain aging, things like that, in small group settings. So they still got together. It was not a no-contact control group. It was an education-only control group. So perhaps even just that small, those social gatherings made people think that their memory was doing a little bit better too. And it does seem that we see age-related, it's reducing age-related decline in health-related quality of life. So I guess the takeaway from this is that we learned a lot of valuable information from active, and I look forward to hopefully that there'll be future studies that really carries this forward. I'm going to talk a little bit now, switching gears from the active study over to this finger study that Maria touched upon earlier. And this is a study that is giving giving older adults training in a few different areas. They start off with some diet and nutrition, and this is group meetings and individual sessions. They go on to some physical exercise, and they've sort of purposefully staggered when they bring on different interventions, so everything doesn't start all at once to overwhelm individuals who are participating. But it focuses on strength and cardio for that physical exercise, and I know we're going to have an exercise talk a little bit later. And then here's finally the cognitive exercises, which is the focus of my talk. And these are group meetings, and then that focus on independent training. And so this was a 24-month study from a beginning of the intervention until the end. And this is the results at 2 years. And I think, again, as Maria alluded to earlier, what we now see from FINGER is that there is some improvement on cognitive tests. What we don't know yet is how this is going to impact potential, does this training delay the onset to mild cognitive impairment or dementia? We don't know that yet, so continued follow-up is going to be very, very important. But what we do see at 2 years is that there is improvement in executive functioning, so that ability, those higher level tasks, that speed of processing. But unfortunately, there is not an improvement on memory performance. On memory, their ability to do some memory tests was not significantly different between those who received the intervention and not. But we did see some benefits and look forward to some additional findings coming out from the FINGER study over the next several years. Switching gears a little now, I'm going to talk about another real-world setting, which was not formal cognitive training, but it was embedding cognitive training and some physical exercise, if you will, in real-world settings. And this was a study. It didn't start off as a study. It was a community-based program that researchers said, well, let's create a formal study. And now AARP has rolled out Experience Core across many, many cities in the United States. And I'm embarrassed that I did not look to see if there's one in the Orange County area, but it's really quite remarkable. And what Experience Core is doing is it's taking older adults and putting them in inner city schools where students really need the attention. So elementary schools, K through 3, and pairing the older adults with the younger kids. And what their thought is that, gosh, those little elementary school chairs, they're really little. And these older adults who are rather sedentary are having to get in and out of these little chairs on a routinely basis, getting down at the level of the elementary school students, helping them with their reading or their spelling or their math, engaging them socially. Perhaps these were adults who were at home a lot of time. Maybe they wanted a volunteer activity, so it's also giving them something purposeful. And there's a social engagement to it as well, that they're not only with younger children, they're with teachers, and they're with their peers, their older adult peers through Experience Core meetings. So there's a thought of this cognitive stimulation going on, not formal training, but cognitive stimulation, social engagement, physical activity, little chairs. And so what you're going to see is, so that the thought is that maybe each of these are going to move in and helping with function, with strength, your ability to get up and down, maybe climb stairs. How's your social support? Are we seeing better changes in mood and cognition? And then there's their primary outcomes that they were really looking at: mobility, ability to carry out those independent activities of daily living, a person's quality of life, their cognitive function, and then maybe even healthcare costs. Could something as simple as this, which helps everybody in the community, could it have long-term overreaching effects? So here's a snapshot of the participants. This is the table, those who were random. This was a small study that took place in Baltimore. And for those of you who are familiar with, who know Baltimore, there's a pretty big inner city area where the schools really did need help. 70 participants were randomized to the Experience Core at the very beginning, and then 58 remained on a waitlist control that were then transferred over, got to help after the intervention, after the main intervention was over. Average age was around 70, so they were older adults. Average age of education was just under 12. So again, we're targeting those people who really need this intervention, and not just the the retired professors who are looking to go do some volunteer work. 65% had an annual income less than $15,000 a year. So they were really targeting, again, that the needy. 94% were African American. and predominantly women. So you could go on, a lot of health conditions in this population. They were not the ultra healthy that you typically see in clinical trials. And here's the results after, this was after I think this was at the 1-year follow-up. And what I want to show here is that this table is teasing apart both when those people came in and they did some executive functioning tests, some were normal and some were they were classified as impaired, that their executive functioning skills were not as good. And what we see here is that just participating in experience core, those who had impaired executive functioning when they started the study improved on several measures compared to the control group. They improved on some other executive functioning tests, the trails, and their memory, their episodic memory measures improved after doing experience core. And I think that this is kind of remarkable because, again, this wasn't a formal cognitive training. This was cognitive stimulation, but we are seeing some measurable effects. Another study has followed up with experience core and even shown changes in hippocampal brain volume in women after the experience core study. So again, something is going on here, and the exact mechanisms are not quite clear yet, and it was a small study that needs to be replicated, certainly, so take that in mind. But I think it does offer another promising avenue of something that's real world, easy to implement, and can benefit multiple generations in a community. So just a summary of the experience core findings to date. So so far, what we're seeing is, again, that small intervention placing people in schools did result in improved executive functioning and memory performance, particularly in those who were impaired executive functioning at the time that they started. People who joined Experience Core improved in their social activity, so they had a bigger social network. They weren't as isolated in their homes. And their physical activity improved. Their ability, they were walking more after Experience Core. They were able to climb stairs faster. So particularly in some of these inner city buildings where they did have to walk up many flights of stairs to get to their apartment, this was transferring over to the real world levels, and their strength improved. So this is all coming around to say that short-term participation in a community-based program that was really just all about helping the children does transfer over to some real-world settings and may benefit abilities that are critical to functional independence, so keeping people in their homes longer. I think that's one of the things that we all go for. So that's where we're at. I mean, there are many smaller studies on cognitive training, cognitive stimulation, but I wanted to provide a snapshot of some very large studies. As Maria said earlier, there are a number of studies. Many aren't that big. Many are very small sample sizes or were very short interventions, so I didn't want to focus on those today. But I want to switch gears now and talk about computer games because those tend to get a lot of attention in the press. And if you they say, well, maybe if you just play this Nintendo game, or I'm probably using the wrong ones, but that you will start your memory and thinking abilities will improve to that of a younger person. So there are a handful of small studies, very short follow-up usually, giving people the opportunity to play the game for a little bit, and then they study them again. And what those overall show is that there's really very small, short-term improvements, and that they don't transfer. So you might do better at that particular skill that you were doing on the computer game. Maybe your reaction speed is faster because you were playing a video game that had you do something with that skill, but it doesn't transfer, and it's very short-lived. Those effects do dissipate over time. And one of the goals with these computer games tend to say, well, if you do this, your brain's going to be as healthy as a 20-year-old. And that's not true. Actually, if you give the 20-year-old and the older adult, if they both do the computer game, the 20-year-old's going to improve a lot more than the 65 or 75-year-old. So you're never going to be at that same level. So I guess the take home for this is they don't really hurt, but there's no strong evidence that they really help. Really, this is more about cognitive this is doing something over and over again. You get a little bit faster, but it's not going to transfer over to those daily activities of life that's going to help you and maintain that functional independence. And there is no evidence that these brain games delay time to diagnosis of MCI or dementia. So I'll just close with a summary is, because I do want to leave plenty of time for question and answer, is that cognitive training may delay cognitive decline in healthy older adults. There is some evidence, particularly from the active study, more results to follow from FINGER. So it may prevent some of that cognitive decline, and I think the key question is, does it delay diagnosis to MCI or dementia? That's what we all really want to know. And unfortunately, there's limited evidence that in people with MCI or dementia, that training will help. So far, there's been various studies that have looked at training with a therapy, and so far there's very little evidence, particularly when trying to do memory training in a population that already has a memory impairment. In studies like Experience Core do show that real-world stimulation offers a short-term benefit, but more research is really needed to see what the long-term benefits are. And then studies such as FINGER do show that a multifaceted approach that combines heart-healthy things like diet and exercise along with cognitive training does at least show a short-term benefit on some cognitive domains with more time needed to show what the full results are going to be. But that's really an interesting avenue since we know what's heart healthy is brain healthy. If we can combine all of the things at once, does that eventually delay diagnosis? So I'll end here, leaving plenty of time for questions. I really want to thank you for inviting me here today.
In the active,
I just want to make sure that the microphone does get to the person that's asking the question so that everyone can hear it. So, where's the, okay, go ahead.
in the active study at 10 years, they were 83 years of age. What was the attrition rate with this study? Do you know?
That's an excellent question, and I don't remember that number off the top of my head, but I can look it up and find out that at least at the 5-year data, which I do remember, there was the attrition rate was maybe it was about 5%, I think, per year. So very low attrition rate. They were very committed to participating in this study. They felt a connection to the study staff at each of the investigator sites. They felt social. So people weren't dropping out as much as you would expect in a population that was 83 years of age. But I don't remember the tenure, so I will look and find out for you.
Yeah, I was just wondering, death rate, that kind of thing at 83.
I'm sorry, what was that?
I was wondering about the death rate, that kind of thing, too.
Yeah, so there, of course, over a 10-year study, there were some deaths. They were equally spread across the training and the control arm. So, the results were still pretty consistent. I think we can take something away from the results. But yes, there were deaths.
Right here in the front? No, no, just next time, next one. Sorry.
Okay.
I was just wondering, when is a good time to conduct these brain fitness activities to seniors?
What's a good time? Do you mean at what age?
Well, like in the morning, afternoon.
So, interestingly, Active really tried to work around people's schedules. And so they didn't prescribe to say that all training is always done in the morning because they realized that some of these participants were helping out with their grandchildren at home, maybe getting them off to, maybe helping get them off to school or responsible for picking up. So they did try to work with their schedules. That said, I would say that a morning time is typically best, but they didn't say that training had to be done in the morning.
As to exercise, have there been studies done relative? Is this on?
Yeah.
Have there been studies done relative to the difference between medium to brisk walking compared to running and getting the heart rate up?
So there's going to be a whole talk on exercise today. So perhaps I think maybe we'll hold off on that topic because I think it's going to be addressed. But certainly, what we say is that aerobic exercise, really getting that heart rate up, is what is needed. But there's going to be a whole talk. Okay.
I know you mentioned video game playing, but what about these phone games, Lumosity, Elevate? I've been doing those, and do they help?
So I'm going to choose my words carefully. So far, they haven't done many studies to show that they help, right? So that they don't hurt. What we don't know yet is how much they really help, really, to be honest. That they're engaging and you're using your brain and you're stimulating your brain, that's good. We don't know how much that transfers over to improvement in memory and thinking ability, your daily tasks, and of course then does it delay MCI or dementia. So there have been Posit Science did take over some of the active training interventions that were developed in active, that speed of processing. I think it was purchased by Posit Science. This is not an endorsement by any means. But I guess what I was trying to say is that some of the companies are taking things that were done, developed for academic research, and now applying them in their company, and others are developing things in-house, and they just haven't been studied to the level. So I'll say that they don't necessarily, they can't hurt, but right now we can't say that they really, really help. And there's a question up front, I know.
And there's one in the back. We'll take the one in the
Yeah.
back first, and then one up front.
So are you telling me that the good feeling I get about whipping out the Monday and Tuesday Sudoku is nice, but the stress I feel of trying to do it on Friday is a lot better?
That's exactly right. And I don't know what it says about me that I avoid them altogether, so.
I'm right here. Did the experience study also measure any of the effects on the children, and also anything about the social interaction or the sense of well-being of the?
Yes, they did. They also followed up with the improvement on both the children at the classroom level, at the school level, schools that were allowed to participate in an experience course. So there's actually a lot of research even then on the community partnerships that were required between the public school systems and the university. It's a wonderful body of research. I haven't focused so much on the children. I know that they did show some benefits. I don't know how long those lasted or I'm not as well versed on the longer term outcomes for the children. So sorry, but it's a remarkable program.
So my question is about the active program where, did anybody take a look at how the social training program would have worked vice maybe something that was more individual?
We didn't look at that. So there have been other studies that looked at group training versus individual at-home training, and what they found is that group training showed a benefit compared to that at the individual. When you did it at home alone, there was not nearly as good of an effect, and that's probably because that social interaction and the ability to ask questions and clarify things. So when you're doing it at home by yourself, there's not nearly the improvement as doing it in a group training. But active itself did not look at individual versus group. That was done in a separate study by another group of researchers. So it does speak to the social interactions and the group dynamics. And also, we don't know when you're doing it at home how well you're really taking in the information.
Has anybody studied taking courses, whether it's like grade courses or college courses, as people age? And where is Banner Alzheimer's?
Banner Alzheimer's Institute is in Phoenix, Arizona, and so I'm delighted to be here today. It was a nice, quick flight. Whether somebody studied those who take courses in in later life. I don't know if it's been a formal research study, but we do show that it's part of that cognitive stimulation. So those who are doing large epidemiological studies that show people who are doing lifelong learning do be better, but I don't know of a study that's looked at people who are enrolled versus not enrolled and what those impacts are. There's one more. This
One
gentleman.
more question right there. Take that last one.
Yes, I don't know what the exact test was involved in the active study for speed of processing, But I know that the double decision-making task also improves speed of processing. I guess, first of all, theoretically, why is speed of processing so much more affected than memory and reasoning? And secondly, what real-world tasks, other than driving and things like that, does speed of processing clearly relate to?
Well, the speed of processing, they were focused on the real world being driving. That is exactly right, because the thought was being able to keep people at home independent longer would have a benefit. So while it might not seem like a big enough deal, that in a real world setting, that is big. As to why the speed of processing was, why it was so much bigger than memory, it could also have something to do with the training. So what Active chose to do for the memory training might not have worked for everybody. So that's one body of research is saying, well, for some people, maybe we don't need to focus on every type of mnemonic device. Let's focus on the few that really work for you and get you improved on that, as opposed to providing a variety. Some people are very visual, some people are just better at memorizing, et cetera. So it could be that, in my personal opinion, is that the memory training offered too many choices to everybody, as opposed to focusing on one training, whereas the speed of processing training was focusing on one strategy and got everybody really good on that one particular strategy.
So some kind of individualized training.
Exactly. Let's find out what works for you as a person and provide those skills to you, as opposed to every type of skill, then you trying to pick and choose which device, which of these skills might be best for you.
We do have to move on.
Okay.
So